And
Recording in progress.
and before we get started, just if you're joining us, just some housekeeping reminders that this webinar is being recorded. You do have a Q&A feature to drop questions for our panelists. We hope to be able to get to a couple of those, but we will be in follow-up sending out a response to our most frequently asked questions. The chat feature is there where we'll be sharing out resources to supplement the discussion. And we're really happy to be able to say that we had almost 1,000 people registered from 104 countries today. And we do plan on sharing the recording of the event so that we can continue to reach thousands. This is just a testament to how so many people recognize this as a timely discussion and an important issue. With this housekeeping, I am going to introduce Michael Karen. He is a CSR executive consultant. You can read his full bio in the program, but he's a highly experienced corporate social responsibility, ESG, and nonprofit executive consultant with deep expertise in social responsibility, strategy, strategic philanthropy, corporate environmental sustainability, governance, and implementation and evaluation. Michael, thank you so much for joining us today. We're really looking forward to this conversation. I know it'll be really engaging between the three of you. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it to you.
Thank you, Yvette, and hello to everyone. I really appreciate the opportunity to be part of this gathering and to be joined by two experts in the field, Rashonda Perryman from Vanguard Foundation and Nina Vollmer from the Global Child Fund. We had a good opportunity to talk yesterday to kind of get our speaking points aligned to what we think will provide all the folks who are attending today with the greatest value and hopefully some pragmatic tips. One of the things that we want to be really clear about is not working in some great cloud of theory, but rather talking about our direct experiences in this work and how we can really redouble efforts across sectors and particularly with corporations to address early childhood education. I am very lucky to have started my career in education and have been involved with organizations that have provided direct service in early childhood education to underserved communities historically. And so this topic is really close to my heart and also really gets to a place that I've been living, if you will, in my professional career as a practitioner in ESG and CSR and now as a consultant. In our panel today, we really want to talk to you about what ESG, environmental, social, and governance work is and what it isn't. I think there's a lot of misnomers about what it is. There's also great differences between how ESG is practiced in the United States versus the EU versus developing regions across the world. We want to make sure that we spend some time talking about what that looks like and why. But before we go into that and talk about what ESG really is and where we see it going, I want to give my fellow panelists an opportunity to introduce themselves and talk to you a little bit about their background and their expertise in this area. So, Rashonda, can I call on you first to give a brief introduction?
Sure. Can you hear me all right?
Yes.
Great. Thank you, Michael. So I am, as Michael said, I'm Rashonda Perryman. I lead corporate philanthropy at Vanguard. Vanguard is one of the largest global asset managers, and our mission is to take a stand for all investors, to treat them fairly, and to give them the best chance for investment success. And I personally really value the fairness aspect of that mission. Aligns very nicely with my own personal value system. And I say that because I always sort of laugh at the fact that I've ended up in corporate America. I started my career as a preschool teacher. I was a social worker working with women and children. But I've spent the last 12 years in philanthropy, and I really, really count it as a privilege to be able to direct funds to organizations and toward the system of early childhood. I see it as my life's mission. Young children, families, their communities. It's the work that I was put on this earth to do. So I'm privileged to be able to be in a philanthropic role where I can direct dollars there. So I am very excited to be chatting with you all today and listening to all the other conversations. Thank you, Michael.
Thank you, Rashawn, and welcome, Nina.
Hi, Michael. Hi, Rashonda. Nice to see you again. Just checking so that you can hear me all right as well before. Yeah, perfect. So yeah, very happy to be here. As you were saying, I'm Nina Folmer. I am Director of Child Rights and Sustainability at Global Child Forum. We're a small Swedish foundation working towards large businesses better understanding and managing their impact on children. Looking at everything from child labor to products and services down to community and environment. And we do that mainly through a huge benchmark that we perform every year where we look at reporting, but we also do engagements with companies. So happy to share some of our insights and some of our experiences from there today.
Terrific. Thank you very much, Nina and Rashonda. Both, I think this will be a great conversation. One of the things that we wanted to make sure that we were able to address right out of the bat is what is ESG, and I know from the previous panels that have been happening in this conference, as well as probably what you've read and seen in different perspectives, ESG can be defined in a lot of different ways. I had a client not too long ago that asked me to help them unlock their pathway into a company's ESG budget. And it made me smile because in reality, there is no ESG budget in corporations. There are broad different things that corporations do in their sustainability practice, in their governance practice, and in their social practices that have resources. And it's the opportunity to tap in and align with those that I think we want to spend a good amount of time today. So when we talk about ESG, it can vary across different places. But I think a couple of points are really, really important when we talk about the S in ESG. And the first is that companies are located in communities. And I know this is a very obvious thing to everyone on this meeting today, but I also think it's an important thing to keep top of mind. Throughout my career, when I started many, many years ago, there was a perspective from corporations that that when workers came to the workplace every day, they left the communities and came to the company, and at the end of the day, they left the company and went back to their communities. That is not how it is approached any longer. Thank goodness, through enlightenment. The reality is that there is a coexistence and a reliance on community well-being and health that is going to necessarily be one of the foundational pieces of company's success, whether it's in its headquarters or location or in its operations. The second thing that I think is really important to know about ESG, and I believe was mentioned a bit on the previous panel, is that ESG is about the practice of risk management on the part of a corporation, but it also is a part of their looking for business opportunities. And business opportunities are not just about sales, they're also about human resources and how people are treated. And it's about reputation, as was mentioned in the last panel. And it's about finding a way to create reciprocal value. And this is a very important theme that you'll hear us talk a lot about today. Reciprocal value, meaning that it's not a one-way street. Years ago, grant making was not thought of as social investing. It was thought of as goodwill and, in many cases, marketing. Now, there is a huge requirement and expectation of corporations to be able to illustrate their real impact in society, not just the positive ones, but also the negative ones. And so ESG is often characterized by reporting, and there are in alignment with standards. And there are two standards and reporting mechanisms that I want to talk about today that kind of illustrate where companies are in their ESG journey. The first is something called the Global Reporting Initiative, GRI. More than 10,000 companies across 100 countries utilize this comprehensive reporting tool to talk about the impacts that their business operations have, both positive and negative, on their stakeholders. And stakeholders necessarily include the communities in which they find themselves operating. GRI has specific callouts around vulnerable communities and vulnerable groups as to how a business is lowering the impact of their operations and the barriers to their services to these groups. And it also looks at very clearly local communities. And that is really another concept that we will spend a good amount of time talking about today, which is that most of this work is local work. It has to be. You're not shipping children miles and miles away for cities away for early childhood education. This happens in the places where companies find themselves operating most strongly. The other standard is the UN SDGs, the United Nations goals that illustrate there are 17 of them, as I recall, and 83% of companies that were included in a report from the GRI have indicated that they align with at least some of these sustainable development goals. However, only 40% are measurably making commitments to the goals that they are addressing. And not surprisingly to this group, the fourth goal, education and access to education and equity in education, is part of the UN SDGs. 42% of companies report that they are aligned with that goal, and not surprising, although I do think that's a relatively low number. But there are other goals that I think the work in early childhood education are inexorably linked to. The first one is poverty. And education as a bulwark against poverty is not a new concept, but an important concept that many organizations are seeing. This is not just about the future workforce of companies, although that has a lot to do with it. It is also about the quality of the potential places where people are choosing to relocate and have their careers. If people do not want to work in a particular location because of the conditions of that location, they are not going to work for the company that is in that location. The second is the third goal in the UN SDGs, which is healthy lives and well-being. And clearly, early childhood education plays a big part in developing communities that are strong, that are resilient. It is a pathway to providing services beyond education and beyond childcare that makes those communities stronger and the character of the folks that live there stronger and less encumbered by social factors. And then finally, the 11th goal in the UN SDGs, which is sustainable cities and communities. And 37% of companies say they align with that. Necessarily, part of a sustainable community is about its education ecosystem, from the very youngest to the very highest level of education. And so ESG is really something that companies take seriously. They report on with diligence and through verifiable metrics. And it's an increasing area for not just managing risk, but realizing opportunities that are provided to those companies through work that they would be doing. There's many pathways to approach companies, but we believe strongly in the work that you all are doing, that the local approach is usually the highest leverage and most impactful. We will also spend time talking about ESG in context to where it is. So in context to where the strategy is developed. ESG strategies look very, very different in the US than they do in the EU, largely because of the nature of the social safety nets in those societies and the needs for the services that you provide. US is much less regulated than the UK, than the EU rather, and developing regions are even much less regulated than the US is. And then, finally, what I would say in this is that it ultimately comes down to alignment with business goals. And it's important for us to really amplify the message that business goals are not just about sales and not just about attracting employee talent. There is an entire function of corporations around reputation and brand, around alignment with goals that reach out to markets that are going to be important for us to think about as we bring advocates in from corporations. It's also important for us to know when you will see social investment strategies versus philanthropic strategies, where money is simply given, versus social investment, where companies are looking for a return on that investment. And we plan to address all of those things in our conversation today. But again, we're going to really stress on the development of reciprocal value by building stakeholder benefit through cross-sector partnerships, and the importance of starting locally. So with that, thank you for indulging my brief overview on this. I want to invite our panel to come in and talk a little bit more about these topics. And I want to start off, Roshanda and Nia, with business alignment. And Roshanda, we talked a good deal yesterday about how your work is aligned very much with the strategy and the imperatives of Vanguard around early childhood education and development. And so I'd love for you to maybe talk a little bit about how those strategic priorities do align, and how your company really found the importance of this alignment in this area.
Sure. So for Vanguard, and I think this is probably true across different sectors as well, right? We know that all of our data, and if you're on the phone, you're on this meeting, you know that young children and what the data might say about the experiences that they have early in life, and how that really has an impact on their trajectory and their growth and development. At Vanguard, it really aligned very clearly with our investment philosophy. So, and our philosophy is pretty simple. Investing early pays off later, right? We work with our clients to create long-term investment visions that draw upon really powerful choices financially that can be made currently or in the early years of their life that pay off later. So that wasn't an easy leap for leaders when they started thinking about where might be the place where we could have our biggest impact um, philanthropically. So early childhood, while it might seem like a stretch for a investment management company, it actually wasn't. It made sense internally. We didn't have to do a lot of um, lobbying around it. People got it, but there were some key areas that we lifted and we continue to lift. One is the economic return. Um, Given we are an investment company, we do have a different philosophy, but we are an investment company, so the economic return meant something, right? The reduced rates of special education, the reduced rates of incarceration and participation in the penal system, reduced healthcare expenses that children, as they grow, that our research was able to show out made a difference. In the US, we have a return of about 13% of that. And focusing on those high quality opportunities early in life really made a difference. Like, we could show the data, we could track it for our board, we could track it for our employees, but how, if we invest early, we could see those impacts later on. And on top of that, and most importantly, I think for someone like me who comes to this work with a real passion for families and children and outcomes, on top of that, there was this real long time long-term life outcomes for children, those who are able to benefit these programs, including higher graduation rates, home ownership, job attainment, long-term health, all those things that I know. When I think about my own community, the community that I grew up in, it makes a difference in young children being able to have those experiences early. So being able to direct dollars and align those dollars to sort of scaled impact and being able to see what that outcome looks like over time for an individual and how that individual builds out a community. Again, it wasn't a big sale for us to make that natural connection. And I'll just say, right, like that I'm sure that other sectors, right? Like Vanguard, we're talking about investments early for later outcome, but there are other sectors. We're all looking for a workforce for tomorrow. We're all looking for people who understand soft skills. You learn those things early in life. So the ability and the notion that our philanthropic dollars could aid to what the world looks like later on, we sold it and it was bought big time. And our company still believes that even after we're sort of evolving and thinking about what our next phase of early childhood work looks like.
Thank you. And I want to circle back on some of the things that you had mentioned there and ask a couple of additional questions. But I want to
Sure.
go to Nina because you have such a broad perspective of different companies that you've seen working in this space, and also the differences that were mentioned that I mentioned earlier in the ESG strategy from different countries and different locations. I'd love for you to maybe talk about what you've seen as really strong and compelling cases for business alignment with those companies, and maybe what some of the pitfalls have been to getting those companies, some companies, to recognize that there is alignment. They're just not paying enough attention to.
Yeah, thanks. So I think this is a topic that I'm very passionate about, and it's also something that we've at Global Child Forum we've seen this in the research that we have done on companies for a long time. Sort of education is something, and children are things that companies talk about openly. They want to show the support, and we look at companies across the globe, as you were saying, Michael. So we see a lot of different examples, and we really see that the motivations behind has a lot to do with culture, with social security frameworks, like what is available in terms of childcare, education, parental leave. All of those things have an impact, but also legislation, of course, and geographies. So there are many different ways of getting into this, and companies have different motivations, but it's always rooted in the community and their understanding of who they are as a corporate citizen, or sort of as an organization in the communities where they operate. With that said, we also see that when we engage on these topics, and I just remembered now when I was listening back, we actually did a mapping study of this back in 2018, looking at what are the things that these companies really invest in. And we could see that, unfortunately, early childhood is not the biggest sort of ticket item for companies to invest in. It's rather primary, secondary education, to some extent, sort of supporting university. So I think there is, and I don't think this has changed too much in these years, unfortunately. So I think we can kind of still assume that sort of stays the same. So there is an attention gap to this part of children's lives. And as you were saying, Roshanda, how important it is, and what the investments that you make in this period really sort of pays off, both for children, but also for society. And I think I was making some notes here, because what you can almost like group the rationale that companies have for getting into this field in 4 different groups. So it has to do with being a family-friendly company, sort of supporting workers who are parents, making sure that often this has to do with gender equality and getting women back into work. And then you support kind of childcare or other types of sort of early childhood sort of models to get your employees back safely and sort of contently into the workplace again. The second is investing in the community, as you were saying, Michael, sort of investing where you work and making sure that the community is thriving and that kind of support what's around you. And we've seen some interesting examples, for example, from Japan, where we see that what real estate companies invest in making sure that you can have childcare in the buildings that they build, because it's a scarce commodity and it's very difficult and very expensive to get childcare. So they do something there to try and provide these spaces, but they could probably do more. So there are seeds of this that we can see, but there are also opportunities to kind of push them to do more on these topics where they're already seeing the sort of the value of it. Investing in the future workforce, which we've already kind of seen a bit, where it's seen more as a social investment and more of a long-term commitment. But we also see, and we heard in the session before around supply chain, and this is something that we really see kind of perhaps the more forward-leaning companies seeing supply chain impacts, not necessarily, and I'm talking about big global companies now, right, and their suppliers. So traditionally, you talk about child labor and that you should eliminate child labor and you should keep it under control. We know that this doesn't work. Big companies trying to do this, it has absolutely no effect on child labor whatsoever. It just sort of moves around. What we do know, what we do see is that what really has an effect is when you invest in the community, because child labor and quality education and early childhood care are really strongly correlated. So if you provide childcare, you provide education, that has a positive effect on child labor. And here we can both see how kind of corporate companies in the supplier countries can work with this. They can work with their buyers, and there can be a reciprocal relationship in terms of those investments that also lower risk for both the supplier companies and the buyers, who are very keen to show that they're doing everything in their power to minimize the risk of child labor, which is a big reputational risk. So there is one of the kind of the opportunities that we have seen to get into the conversation in a different way than starting off talking about sort of from the child rights perspective. This is more from a business perspective. Why should they invest in this? Well, it's actually good for their bottom line.
And, Nina, I think you brought up a very interesting point about supply chain. And, I use the analogy that I think most people understand the concept of supply chain, but there is sort of a dark reputation, if you will, about how companies, especially larger companies, manage supply chain. I won't call out the large retailer that I'm thinking of by name.
One we
but
might come to think of.
You can probably think of one. But it had a reputation for many, many years of trying to make sure that they were getting the lowest price of anything on the products they wanted from their suppliers, to the point that they were reducing the viability of those companies to compete in any real way because they own the market. Increasingly, companies like that, and that company in particular, has realized that in making that pressure in the times that they had, they're also risking exactly, Nina, what you had brought up, which is the reputational risks of pushing a supply chain too far. And child labor is certainly part of that, but there are lots of other parts of that, including environmental impacts and quality of life impacts that I think are very much related to early childhood education. I think that was, a very important point. I want to follow up. I want to ask a follow-up question to you, and then I want to go back to Rashonda real quick. But I'm interested in the work that you all are doing. When you see that change happen in corporations, or if there are aspects of the adoption of support of this kind of work by corporations that indicate that those companies are moving from funders of it to now advocates for it, and if is that a trend that you see, and if not, are there some that have done it somewhat successfully in your experience?
That's an interesting question. I'm not sure we're seeing a trend necessarily, but we do see that there are kind of those different levels of engagement, as you were saying, sort of There is more of the charity and the transactional, which is, it's nothing wrong, but it's often where people start. So that's like, we have these dollars, we can give them to something good, let's do that. And then as you do that and develop relationships with these organizations and the communities, you often realize that, hey, maybe we want to be more involved actually, and we want to sort of be part of this. And you also, there are branding opportunities, let's be honest about that, that if you can show that you're a good corporate citizen and you're investing in the community, that's a good look on you if you do it ethically and correctly. So it's almost like a sort of the steps of evolution in terms of understanding social investment, and the kind of evolved state, I guess, is where you're making these investments and you're trying to see the return, as Roshanda was talking about, and sort of really getting into this as an involved party that sees the value beyond sort of doing good.
So that's really helpful. And I asked that question very, very purposely because I have a question now to bring to Rashonda. And just a little bit of background on that. One of the great jokes that have been used in fundraising forever and ever and ever, and I'm not I can't say that I haven't fundraised in my life. I've done a bunch of it. Is that the one thing that people can never really fault you for when you make an appeal is when you say, it's for the children, right? Who's going to be against children? Who's going to be against feeding the hungry? But there's a very real issue around that was actually addressed many years ago, and I may be too old. I may be the oldest person on this panel, but I remember this well in the 90s from the Boston College Center for Corporate Citizenship. They published an article as corporate citizenship was just beginning to take root in corporate America in the US, and it was called Conversations with Non-Believers. And the gist of the article was really about talking to executive leadership to understand, what you had just so well described going on with corporations, which was around this shift now to understanding a citizenship and investment component that corporations had to provide. And so that's the prelude, Rashonda, to the question that I have for you, because when you started this work and when you came to Vanguard, what do those conversations look like with executives? Because without executive sponsorship and backing, this kind of work in corporations just can't happen effectively. And so I'd love to hear from your perspective how you've had those conversations with non-believers, and what are some beyond, oh, it's for the kids. How have they come to this realization that this is an important thing for their business to do?
Yeah. Vanguard is a data-driven institution. And the good thing about early childhood is that we have a lot of data. And so we were able to walk into the conversation with so much sort of long-term longitudinal studies that talked about the impact of putting dollars in this space. And over time, right away, we began to measure how our dollars were having impact. We looked at our dollars across our own measures, how we were doing the work. Were we building the kind of relationships we wanted to have impact at scale? Were we thinking about all of the potential partners that could come to the table? But we were also thinking about the direct outcomes that our organization and institution wanted to see. If we said that was not enough, high quality early childhood seats, our organization wanted to see how you're going to get there. And so we began to really measure out. Right now, we got, I think when we started, there was about 100,000 seats in Philadelphia where we're located. Our biggest chunk, we're a global company, but we're located mostly in Philadelphia. At the time, there were about 100,000 early childhood seats. And the vast majority of those seats, based on research, we could tell were low quality seats, meaning they didn't have certified teachers. They were likely in places that weren't safe and unhealthy. The environments weren't the environments that we know really stimulate learning and development for young children. So we went about the business of changing that. And if you know about how do you change, big institutional kinds of sort of hiccups, you have to do it one thing, after the other. we had to start with teacher training programs. We had to think hard with the local universities. We had to think about where are these communities that these institutions, early childhood programs are in? What are the houses? If you think about family child care, what do the houses look like? And we started putting dollars into each one of those sectors to try to build them up, knowing that we were taking a multi-year approach to that. And we went into our boardroom with that in mind, saying this isn't going to happen overnight. If we're getting into this, we got to know that we need at least a decade to see this change. And we begin to measure. So every year, we put a scorecard in front of them and say, this year we went up, this year we went down. The pandemic, and we can talk about childcare slots and the pandemic and the attrition that happened because of that. But at the end of the day, our board was just able to see sort of that steady knock against whatever that measure we were trying to get to. And I think the other thing that we outright tried to do and that we were honest about is that, we looked at some data early on and said that if we were to pool every philanthropic dollar that was available for early childhood, it would really get at only, I think there literally it was like 3% of what was actually needed. And so we were honest about that. Like we're not about to our dollars, particularly our small portion of that big philanthropic pie wasn't going to change things. So we had to think about what then does. And we started going after that big system level movement, right? We don't do direct advocacy. I'm not, talking to our local US legislators. That's not my role here at Vanguard, but we certainly fund advocates. We fund those who are going to educate legislators about the benefits. And that's another place that we started tracking. We could show our board this is increasing. The dollars that are moving into early childhood that will be year over year, that's increasing. So, to your question, it was really being able to make data informed decisions and starting with that data.
So I couldn't agree more. I mean, data does drive decisions, and the other part of that equation is that when those decisions are made, that's how resources are allocated. And I absolutely
Mhm.
love the way that you brought the idea of advocacy on the part into it, and that's a very unusual thing to be able to do inside a corporation and to bring
Correct.
corporations to a comfort level with funding people who are advocates and sometimes activists. This is a very difficult space, certainly in the sustainability and environmental world. It gets even more blurry, I think, when you're starting to talk about issues like early childhood education, which may not be directly in the minds of a lot of executives related to what their purpose, their core purpose of their business is. And I think
Yeah.
that's a great insight to share.
Well, I will
Um,
say, Michael, that this is, if I could just, the one thing I
Please.
would say is that I think that's where your commentary on it's for the children actually works, right? Like but it's a bipartisan. Certainly, we think about how to get the dollars there differently, but there's not many legislators who are going to turn their back on that. So to be able to talk about our advocates who understand how to talk about young children who've done the work, that is very different from many other do-good sectors that are much more polarizing than young children, babies, right?
Absolutely,
We can show a picture of
absolutely.
a baby at any given time and be able to sort of shift things some.
Yeah, it's amazing how people's the tone of their voice and the expression on their face changes when they see the picture of a
Right.
child and start to think about the story of that child, right?
Mhm,
And that's
mhm.
really what I think is so compelling about the case, but also so difficult about the alignment, right? Is that very thing? When do we let the data take over? When do we steer directionally with our emotions, and then let the data take over
That's right.
to understand what we're actually trying to impact and change? Um,
That's right.
so we've talked a lot so far about what I think is relatively high level things around business alignment, and I hope that's valuable because I think where we go in the next part of this conversation really is a little bit more on the practical side, and what I hope that this will be able to allow us to do is talk a little bit more about the how, right? How does this get done? How do these conversations happen? And something that we talked about a great deal yesterday when we were together um, was uh, uh, was the idea of translation. I made a joke yesterday that the NGO sector and the for-profit sector are separated by ideology only. To do a good job, you need to run a good business no matter what you're doing. The corporations want to become the biggest and put everyone out of business. The NGOs want to solve the problem and put themselves out of business. But everything else is very, very similar. But part of making that happen is bridging across sectors and being a translator. And I think that's a key thing for people who are in these positions to attract resources to support the work they were doing. And so I was wondering, Nina, if I could maybe start with you to talk a little bit about what you've seen in terms of the dialogues that have been successful between those people who are providing these kinds of services and advocating for these services and the funders and corporations. What are the key ways to get this message across? What are the roles of the translators that so many of the people on this meeting will have in their responsibilities?
Yeah, and I think we talked at length about this yesterday, right? Because it's such an important part of getting through is this translation piece, and being able to kind of come from an NGO background or from a childcare background, like with the expertise and the language that you use, which is everyday for you, and then get into this business environment where completely different words are being used for what we feel is the same thing. And there might be sort of miscommunication there or misunderstandings. And I think what is really lovely and what both of you were saying is like, if you come and talk about children, most people will open their doors and they will listen, and people will sort of be open to it. But the difficulty comes in the next step when it's like, yeah, but I want the money, or I need this investment. And then sometimes like people's eyes glaze over, and you talk about child rights and you talk about all these different metrics and theories of change and whatever. And a lot of people in the business sector will just go, maybe not for me. So I think it is really important to understand who are you talking to, what makes them tick, and sort of what is success for them, or what are they looking for? Because I think sometimes it's also they're looking for something good to do, and they might not have the expertise in-house to find that. So somebody coming from the outside can give this opportunity and can really kind of guide, as long as you can put it into a context where it makes business sense to put this money here. And it is often about sort of bottom line, the business case, sort of talking about what does the money do when you put it there. And sometimes that can feel transactional and a bit dirty, but I think it's the way you need to go to get through there, because you might also get to a person that's very committed in sort of their space, but they need to sell this to somebody else, and they need to have those arguments and all of that data on sort of to come with them to get buy-in from all levels and get the resources they need.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I think that as we mentioned earlier, it's really about how do you describe to these potential supporters and investors, right? And using the right term, whether it's a supporter or investor, around what that reciprocal value is. What's this return that you're giving? You're not going to double their money when they give you, $5. You're not going to give them 10, but you're going to have a return on that investment for them. There's going to be value for them, whether it's for their employees, whether it's for their reputation, whether it's for their own standing with elected and appointed officials and regulators in their industries. And that becomes, I think, so absolutely important. And Rashonda, I think because of where you sit, you have kind of a very unique view of talking to the practitioners in this field and talking to people who are supporting the decisions that you and your team are making inside the company. Can you talk a little bit about what you've seen to be really successful ways that people in early childhood education have been able to address this idea of creating value for their supporters and investors?
Sure, I can start by saying, Nina, I couldn't agree more. And I know we had this conversation yesterday, but like this notion of translation is just key. And as I have grown in my role and really understood, because I didn't come into this role, I came into this role ready to do really deep, good early childhood work. But it took me a couple years before I realized sort of how I didn't understand what was happening business wise, and that I actually needed translation from, the board that I was sitting in front of. I'll tell just a quick story that, in early childhood, we talk about technical assistance, or at least in the sort of the US based frame, where we talk about like teacher coaches, in classroom coaches, or teachers getting the training they need to really be good in classrooms. We talk about technical assistance. So we fund TA, and it's just language. It's, language that's used so much in the early childhood space. So I would say that technical assistance at my board, we're going to support this great technical assistance program. And not until about 2 years in did like someone say, why did you need, why, like, why do you need computers? Why are we funding computers for little kids? And it didn't even occur to me that technical assistance actually meant informational technology, right? And that was such a different like lens from a corporate standing. So the question about like what I've seen work, I actually see myself as a, a bridge here, a liaison. I have really, my team and I, we really have begun to translate help our um, grantee partners translate what they are saying to not just us as funders, but other funders, right? Like we look at our grant applications and we're saying this is language that's not going to be understood. And that was very different because I think that as a grantee partner, and I was on the other side of the table as a partner, like writing to a family foundation is very different from writing a grant, to a corporation. That language just looks different. So that's the first thing I would say, right? It's been seeing myself as in this role of a translator as I've gotten much better at that. The other thing I would say that I've seen organizations do very well, who've been able to pull down those dollars, is going back to what we talked about before, really focusing on, um, and it could feel icky, Nina, to your point, right? Like really focusing on that bottom line, focusing on those numbers. It's hard. I grew up in the social sector. I grew up where, heart mattered and, the development of, like that matters. And certainly it matters. Um, but bottom line is important. And the grantee partners that I see who do it well, from NGOs who do it really well, they are able to talk about that heart and attach that heart to real data.
I think that's enormously important. It does talk to that dual nature, right? Of what people lead with, and there's so many misconceptions. When I started this work years ago, people would say, "Well, why would you invest in TA or infrastructure for a non-for-profit? Their overhead is too big." I would put that same question back to the corporation I was working with, right? Why
Yeah.
is your overhead so big? Are you running a 4% overhead? Because you're not. And why is that different for you and not than it is for a company doing something that is for the social good? It really isn't a difference, and that's kind of the joke around ideology that I shared. We have a limited amount of time. We definitely want to get to audience input and questions. I want to do a really quick lightning round for the last topic that we had prepped for. And so I want to challenge Nina and Rashonda to be really brief, and that is about understanding the transactional versus the transformative, right? A transactional support through versus a transformative investment. And if there's any top line things that you see that moves a supporter from just doing transactional to being able to make that big leap and make a transformational investment in this work. So I again need to keep your answers short, but wanted to make sure that we touched on that. So Nina, can I ask you to go on that one first?
Oh, this was tricky. But I think it is key in that sort of from transactional to transformational, right? So we often start there. So I think it's about finding those points of sort of hot and understanding sort of why are we doing this? What does it bring? And keep on telling the stories to those involved so that they really feel this change and sort of it stops being transactional when you know the people and you know the stories and you know what this is, how this is happening. But you might need to start on the transactional side to get people ready.
Absolutely, absolutely. And Rashonda, the same question for you.
Yep, completely agree with Nina. The other thing I will say is that often companies are looking for, I think our sweet spot in our philanthropy is around our relationship-based approach. And I don't think that is very different from many companies, the way they think about their business work, right? They're thinking about how do I develop deep relationships with my clients so I understand who they are. I take that same value when I'm talking about that with my board. This relationship-based approach moves you from sort of this transactional relationship to one that could have long-term impact, which is then transformational. So I think aligning to the values of relationship and long-term and what moves systems really is the maybe a key to breaking that down a little bit for your board.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's the most overused word in social investment is partnership, and it comes from the investor themselves, the corporation themselves. True partnerships are exactly, I think, Rashonda, what you're talking about. They're long-term, they're goal-focused. There's collective outcomes that both parties are looking for. And most of all, there's trust, which is hard to come by. It's still, the term trust-based philanthropy is a relatively new one, and I'm shocked by the fact that it took so long for people to understand that we have to have trust as a basis for all of our investments. I think our stock markets around the world are showing the weakness of that right now. So with that, thank you both. I've been looking at some of the questions, and Yvette, obviously I'll ask you to, if there's anything that I missed, but I'm looking at some of the questions that came in, and I'll share them with the panel. So the first one is for both of you. Does the Global Child Forum or Vanguard collaborate with the National Association for the Education of Young Children at all? I wish I had some insight to that. I have zero insight to that.
At Vanguard, we do Happy Week of the Young Child, which happens to be NACY's sort of hallmark annual week. We have been long-term partners with them, both from a funding perspective and a partnership. We sit at many of the same tables.
Yeah, I think we don't, but we work in a very different way with sort of more partners who work directly with companies like the center, for example, that were on the panel before. But we do always talk to other people. So if there are possibilities there, I'm happy to, but it's not a relationship we have at this point.
Thank you. So another question that came through from the audience was around the children's rights framework and any guidance or recommendations that this group can offer to ethically engaging business partners in these kinds of investments when the practices of those companies may harm children, whether it's health risks or conflicts of interest and the like. I think this question really is how do you build that common will and that same sense of shared purpose with a company that may not either understand or clearly understands and is willing to live with the risk of some of the harms of what their product is. And I just want to just give an editorial comment before I open it up, Nina, to you and Rashonda, is that I think this is a really important question. And I also think this talks to your ability as fund developers and investment, capital people who are building capital for this kind of work is do your due diligence on who you really want to work with, and understand that just because a company should be a target doesn't mean they will be a target for you, because there are some things that you just may not be able to you may not be able to surmount. But as you do your due diligence, the closer that due diligence is done, the clearer I think it can become as to what the perception of a company is and what the reality of that company might be. Spin from the company notwithstanding, I think there's a lot to be discovered rather than the top headline. But it is really about for me, the diligence. But Rashonda and Nina, I'd love to hear your views on kind of when you have that ethics, when you worry about that ethical gap. What are some of the ways or things that you think about, and how do what advice do you give to this group?
I can just start by
Yep.
okay. I can start just by saying that there are very few companies where children's happiness, their joy, their contentment equals the bottom line. And I think that we just have to be real about that. And when you take these positions, you're choosing something that might not always feel good. And I say that and hold that really deeply in my heart, because when I said at the beginning that I count it a privilege to be able to direct dollars to places that I feel so passionate about, I do that knowing that if I were not in this role, those dollars could go somewhere else. And I just have to hold that. Because I think regardless of where you are, even like family foundations who are doing really great work, you're going to be investing in places that don't necessarily support the well-being of children. It just, yeah, I don't know how else to sort of. I wish there was more that I could hold, but for my own sort of sanity, my team and I talk about this a lot. I just try to hold this value of children's joy and how the dollars and the role that I have can influence that. And I recognize that for others, that's not good enough. Like some people will have to hold the line in a different place. For me, it feels different.
Yeah, I think I hold a very similar kind of position as you, Rashonda, because I think when you get into sort of some of these larger companies, this is not going to be their sort of reason for being, and you need to understand that. And as you were saying, Maka, you need to make a decision. How important is this? And what are my sort of red lines, and what am I not prepared to cross? So that you have that already set out. Because if you get into the whirlwind, you might very well be kind of drawn into something that you don't feel good about. But with that said, I also think it's about like holding that close to your heart, as you were saying, Rashonda, because sometimes, like if we take this example, for example, if you can get a company to invest in children's sort of early development, they might also have a product that you're not super happy about. They're not necessarily mutually exclusive. And I'm just saying this because if they can invest in something good for children, it doesn't make their product worse. It's still going to be the same. So I think there you have to make that kind of ethical choice in terms of what is most important, what are my red lines, and what can I engage with, and what is not okay for me to kind of go into. And then stick to that and look for those who kind of fulfill those different checkboxes for you. Some people you might be able to move, but probably not. So like put your resources where they can make that change rather than butt your head against a wall that will not budge.
Absolutely. Well, we are at time. I want to thank Nina and Rashonda very much for being part of this and spending time with me to help prepare this and share as much great information as you did. I'll leave with one thought about service, and that's what everybody does, I think, in roles like this, and that is that to serve is a responsibility and an honor. To serve with resources is really a privilege. And so when you can exercise that privilege, you're in a very unique space to help all kinds of folks out across sectors. So again, thanks for the opportunity, and Yvette, we'll kick it back to you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Michael. Thank you, Rashonda. Thank you, Nina.
Thank you.
For I'm echoing some of the comments that's coming through, that this has been such a rich and valuable conversation. It really demonstrates and showcases your perspectives, expertise, and passion in ensuring social investment as part of ESG strategy. I think, and I'm going to share the takeaway slide, which really doesn't encapsulate what was covered. There was so many wonderful pieces of knowledge and nuggets that I think all of us had learned from. But what it really comes down to from what we're hearing are the relationships, understanding not only the context in which those relationships are being built, but knowing who you're trying to build a relationship with, and therefore the importance of that translation piece that came so strongly through this conversation. And it really is, understanding what your partner cares about and how to speak to that, and also to be grounded in your own values at the same time. So I think that, as folks have been saying, this is really talking through some of both the challenges, the tensions, but also the opportunities. And as we go into the next session, which will start in 5 minutes from now, oops. We're going to hear some success stories about how this actually works. And it's called Business-ECD Partnerships in Action, Success Stories. We'll be bringing back Sarah Watson to moderate this panel. And we have a wonderful panel from across the world. Gloria Nadecki, Ana Maria Flores, Sarah Hess is coming back, and Juan Garcia. So join us in 5 minutes. That's 50 past the hour. That's 1:50 Eastern time. Thanks so much. We'll see you in a few minutes.